Political change is based on the people. The government is based on the people. Opinions are based on the people, and aid is based on the people. When the basis of everything is people, we believe that the international community's obligation should be to save the people. That should be their priority, especially when natural disasters and warfare strike in certain regions and millions and thousands die. We don't think that people should be used as a battering ram in order to promote for political change. We tell you that people should no longer needlessly die. That is the only value that we promote on Side Affirmative within today's debate. But to first of all clarify the scope of this debate, by political conditions, we mean conditions placed by nation states requiring political reform, such as instituting democracy, free elections, and the rule of law. In other words, conditions that require changes to the political institution of the government. By unjust, we want to look into the concept of global justice. Because we're dealing with actions of the state in relation to another country and its people, we believe that justice means doing good for all stakeholders in the international system and fulfilling their moral and legal obligations by promoting peace and collective security. So having said that, let's directly move on into our contentions. Our first contention, we're going to prove to you why bargaining with lives is principally unjust. We believe that in the status quo, humanitarian aid is effectively used for saving people. For instance, in Afghanistan, through engagement and constant trust building within the government and among the citizens, there was actually a gradual political reform. This political reform is continuing even in the status quo. This kind of continuing effort is what we want to see. But secondly, why should we really apply an absolute standard? We are not willing to sacrifice innocent people who are suffering and dying at this moment. Kant told us that human life is an end in itself. Human life should not be used as a means. Furthermore, the Rome Declaration on World Food Security, Vienna Declaration on Human Rights also stated that food should not be used as an instrument for political and economic pressure. The responsibility to protect, which over 170 countries signed during international forums, states that the international community has a responsibility to assist the state suffering from a humanitarian crisis to fulfill its primary responsibility. If local governments cannot protect their own citizens, then the international community should, especially when they have the resources and the capacity to go in and intervene. But third of all, why should that standard really be human lives? We think that life always needs to be prioritized. First of all, we never really went into these countries and asked whether or not you like politics or do you prefer your life. And that's why we think that because that kind of opinion is not present in the status quo, we need to provide life, and after life, other political rights can follow. Without life, there are no people to promote for democratization in the first place. So which is why we think that that standard should be human lives, and that absolute standard should be applied everywhere, especially in the cases of providing humanitarian aid. So having said that, let's move on into our second contention. Why placing political conditions ultimately increases the oppression against citizens, why that's actually harmful. On the first level, we believe that gradual reformation is absent under side opposition's model. In the status quo, there are certain gradual changes happening because terms can be defined by these regimes. These regimes, to a certain extent, have control over the amount of intervention that can come in to these countries. But during that process, what happens is trust is built between the citizens and the providers of the aid. Trust is built between the government and the international community. Because we think that once these dictators, or whatever they may be, actually decide on their own terms to allow NGOs or other communities to come in and help their citizens, we think that during that process, constant engagement allows people to build more trust. In this case, we believe that when medical aid or infrastructure rebuilding is allowed to a certain extent, people trust the United States, people trust the United Nations, and they see that people are willing to help, that the dictators are the only ones who are unwilling to help. In this case, we think that if we place conditions, this kind of change is completely absent because there is more legitimacy for the government. The government can actually strengthen their line of logic, which runs like this in the status quo. They say that the international community has isolated us, they have intentionally isolated us, and we are the only ones who can save you, therefore follow the great dictator Kim Jong-un and whatnot. We think that by strengthening this kind of logic, it's only going to harm the citizens even more. We want to prevent that oppression. But on to the second point of analysis within our second contention. We think that they block avenues of negotiation that are actively going on in the status quo. What's happening is that negotiation is happening. There is negotiation in international forums and even negotiations within countries such as Burma. In fact, Burma actually reached a consensus within their own country to cease fire and stop the terrorist actions. We think that they basically cut off all possibilities of small changes due to cooperation within the international community. They radicalize the already radical dictatorships because they have no incentive to comply. They know that the international community is willing to kill off all of their citizens. Why would they have an incentive to actually say that we're willing to negotiate, so bring it on the terms? We don't think that that's actually going to happen. That's extremely harmful because you block trust. And if you block trust, you never know when the dictators are going to turn away and suddenly revert to dictatorships again, even if we say that they accepted the political conditions. The last point of analysis regarding why there is more incentive to oppress the citizens simply in general. They see hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker. They see that the United States is using human rights as a bargaining tool. They think to themselves, why can't I do that too? We think that this decreases the legitimacy of international law and basic principles. Furthermore, we think that this encourages dictators to do more of the current actions that they are doing. Even China or Russia, the countries that are currently fueling African dictators, will have an incentive to do more of those unjust actions. It only brings injustice, it kills more people. That's why we're more than proud to affirm today's motion.
So do you think that giving aid to those in need is just?
Yes, because we think that people have the basic right to live, and that basic right to live comes before any other kind of right, whether they be political rights or any kind of right that you want to promote.
Thank you for your value. Then if there is a beggar that is starving out in the streets, are you willing to help that beggar?
Of course.
If that beggar is going to use that money to buy drugs or commit crime, are you still going to give aid?
See, you're trying to draw a weird analogy here. If you're saying that the citizens of these innocent countries are going to use it to buy drugs, that's extremely insulting and offending, because we think that these citizens have immediate necessities in front of their eyes. Let me first of all finish my response. We think that they're not going to actually use it for drugs, but rather they're going to use it to save their families, because no matter how much they're drug addicts or alcohol addicts, they still care about their family, they still care about the devastating damages that natural disasters gave to their houses.
That was a simple misinterpretation of the analogy itself. You're saying that if the corrupt governments take away the money and steal the money in the middle, it will be used for only purposes to strengthen its own regime, which is why the purpose itself of helping those innocent in need will not be fulfilled. So how can you ensure that aid will get to the people in those in need?
Right, exactly what I predicted. Several levels of analysis why that's not true. First of all, we think that there is still a trickle-down effect, which we think would save at least more people than they do, irresponsibly. But second of all, we think that the only reason why you can say that so confidently on side negative is because you think that these dictators are eventually going to change under their model. But we already told you why they first of all have an incentive to practice hypocrisy, but second of all why they actually don't have an incentive to change, because there is no trust between the international community, and only when they prove that premise true can they argue about that analogy.
According to UN report, the trickle-down effect is not happening when the government are actually raiding their own citizens and taking away the supply from their own citizens to strengthen their own regime. So in these situations, the government are absolutely taking advantage out of their own citizens. So you can't simply rely on the trickle-down effects. How do you think about that?
Hey, I don't know where you got the statistics, but we think that, well, in the case of extreme countries like North Korea, maybe that could happen. We think that because of that possibility, we always consider the next step called political change. They ignore that step of political change. But second of all, a majority of the countries actually try and do use that aid responsibly. They still give 20 to 30% of the aid to their citizens. And if that 20 to 30% can save 1,000 more citizens, we are willing to save the 1,000 more lives.
So is your goal saving the least of the lives that is possible if it only saves lives, rather than for future long-term political reformation or the better goods of thousands and millions of people?
Well, no, we're saying that first of all, our basic priority should be saving lives, which is apparently what they're not arguing for. But second of all, we also want to promote for long-term political change. We want you to actually prove why political change is actually going to be possible under your model.
Thank you, and I'll end cross-examination.
Thank you.
This is false illusion, ladies and gentlemen, that we can save lives through unconditional aid. We can't, and that is the reality in the status quo. Aid is interpreted to be helpful only when it gets to the people in need. When the beggar out in the streets use the money for their own sake of committing crime or using it for drugs, we can't really say that that is proper aid. And say it is likewise in the case that we are going through here. If the political aid doesn't get to the people and it is abused by the government, it is stolen in the middle, we can't ask the affirmative side simply naively expect that somehow it will get there. At least some people will be saved because of the trickle-down effect. We don't want to rely on those such risky situations, which is why we say that there has to be a very delicate mechanism in terms of ensuring that the aid will get to the places in need. That is why we strongly negate the resolution. So first of all, the government side defined the motion of political aid conditions as political reform. We say that that is true. However, the first step of achieving political reformations in these countries is with achieving and ensuring that there is a proper distribution of resources. We say that usually political reforms are something that is long-term, and while humanitarian aid is a very short-term and immediate response that is required, which is why we can't certainly expect political conditions as in we want these countries to turn into democracies. But at least from the negative side, we provide that the first step of achieving these political reforms would be having a mechanism to ensure and monitor that the government are properly distributing the aid to the people, and that will be our political condition in today's debate. So having that said, allow me to move on to our first contention, which is that their non-conditional aid absolutely fails. Government bench cannot guarantee that humanitarian aid will be used for the purposes which it was originally intended. The majority of countries that are subject to humanitarian appeals rate poorly on CPI, the Corruption Perceptions Index, which means that humanitarian aid is often provided in weak government environments. And humanitarian aid, in the majority of cases, come in forms of cash, which can't be properly tracked. And even if it comes in the form of food and money, it still is taken away by the government through raids, and it's used to feed their military or to feed their corrupt governments in the case of corrupt regimes. And even if they provide local aid through the NGO sources or whatever sources that they would like to provide with, local government structures and integrity systems may either be completely destroyed or severely disrupted. We're talking about cases in need of humanitarian aid, ladies and gentlemen. In this case, if there is an earthquake, if there is a tsunami, there are no proper local government structures or NGO proper structures to deliver these kind of aid. And when this delivery fails, we say that there is a very inefficient system going on because somehow there has to be a delivery done and that is not properly being done, which is why in this case, international society comes in. And we have to, before properly delivering the sources, we have to get an assurance of the government that these aid will be properly delivered, and that mechanism will be done through our political conditions. We say that the Jane Eglin, Undersecretary General of UN Humanitarian Affairs, warns that if the violence continue to escalate, 11,000 humanitarian workers in the country will be under threat of abduction or being robbed, which is why truck drivers in the status quo are refusing to deliver aid to the people in need because because in such dire situation, people rob, people do crimes of the aid, and they're so desperate of the aid, which is why proper delivery is not being done. We see that we need a system to actually provide checks, and that is through political aid. Our condition 2. Aid is an effective political tool. Why? Because unconditional aid encourages the fiscally imprudent behavior on the part of policymakers. According to Abusai Farah, the Stanford Journal of International Relations, essentially, aid serves as an insurance for incompetent or corrupt leaders from the results of their actions and weakens their incentives to seek alternative revenue sources to rise policies, which means that the government will think that help will come regardless of their irresponsible actions. They can sit still and still the aid will come from foreign countries because people are dying in their country, which only creates more incentive for more irresponsible behaviors of the government itself. The government has no incentive to change because the aid flows in from other countries. Which is why we find that giving aid simply entrenches the privileged positions for money in that group, only giving more power to the government and simply strengthening the regime, which we will not expect. What we need here is accountability, and we're going to create accountability through the foreign aid, that is, through the political conditions that will ensure that the government is actually doing their role in terms of serving their own citizens. We're going to monitor the aid that are going to be distributed properly, which is why we equally value human life and we equally value the right to life as the affirmative side does. Which is why we want to promote our criterion, utilitarianism, in terms of saving most lives possible, and that will be the criteria of today's debate. Moving on to our rebuttals. The government side is saying that they're not willing to sacrifice people, innocent people, and the international society should intervene. That is exactly what we agree with, ladies and gentlemen. We say that people should be safe. We say that international society should intervene. Only under the circumstance that these people will be fed, that the government will not use this money or the budget to create the ballistic missiles or to develop their missile programs. We say that the international society has this capacity to actually intervene and work towards a better good. Moreover, they also talked about the part about negotiation. We say that negotiation is only going on that is only a very minor example to actually generalize all things. If the negotiation is not happening, or if you can't simply rely on the negotiation itself. When there is an immediate direct need, we have to first of all distribute the aid first before simply relying on the negotiations or the further political reforms that will happen in the future. Of course, our goal is political reforms in the long term, but unless we think that can be only kept when there is this immediate relief done. And that is why we strongly say that these reforms can be, and negotiations is a somewhat different approach in the first place. This approach is not something that can be done with development aid or other kinds of mechanisms, but with humanitarian aid, only political conditions are necessary and the just viable method. Therefore, we strongly negate and stand for cross-examination. Thank you.
May I begin?
Yes.
So to sign negative concede, the millions are going to die during the negotiation procedure. During the procedure, like the parliamentary procedures, all those tedious kinds of steps that have to be taken before the condition is agreed to.
When our political conditions are something that are not very difficult to be achieved and something that has no difficulty in achieving and negotiating with, we don't think that there is very much to negotiate with.
Okay, so there's a contradiction there. Because if you're talking about why you're going to suddenly solve black markets, why you're going to solve all of the problems that are occurring in the status quo, if you're saying that the negotiations are so easy to reach, then that definitely undermines the effectiveness of your own negotiations. Because obviously you're implying that you're not changing much in the political system, aren't you?
We're saying that this political system problem itself can be solved in the long term, but right now they have clearly told you that the first step of achieving this political reform would be the proper distribution of the government, not stealing from their own citizens, but actually delivering these aids to their citizens. And we think that this is not a very difficult procedure to negotiate with, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, we still disagree, but let's move on to different different question because they don't seem to agree to our point. So if you think that countries are not going to accept political conditions, because obviously there are going to be some countries that won't, then what are you going to do in the other exception cases?
We say that if these countries are countries that won't accept political conditions as easy, that are going to feed their own citizens, if there are the government that are so responsible enough that are going to neglect their own citizens, we say that these countries won't work in your case either. We are on the same standing line that these countries won't give any aid to their own citizens either.
No, but you're not directly answering the question. I asked if you don't think that if these countries, in certain cases, don't accept the political conditions, then what other solution would you propose for your long-term political change?
We say that this long-term political change is not necessary in the first place because of the political conditions that we're giving anyways. But moreover, we say that simply admitting and simply giving unconditional aid will be tacitly accepting to these oppressive regimes, which is, again, not fair.
Okay, so now we see that they have no other solution if these countries are not going to accept the aid. So moving on into a different question. How can you guarantee that this kind of political change will happen? How can you guarantee that rogue states like North Korea will be willing to face confrontation, not even negotiation, but confrontation and aggressive confrontation in that?
That is the contradiction you're making here, because you say that negotiation is already happening in the status quo, and negotiation was your terms of solving the situation. You should not shift that burden to our side. However, we say that the difference between conditions and negotiation in the political process is that conditions have to be met before the aid is provided, which is why when there is a dire need inside the country, it will have to be met anyways.
So exactly, because you said the political conditions have to be met before we distribute the aid, it's going to cause millions of deaths in the middle. But we think that, well, there's a fundamental difference between negotiation and confrontation and aggressive means of attaching political conditions in the most dire conditions where you most direly need aid. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I begin?
You may.
It is ironic how side negative argues for justice, when the very people who made the idea of justice in the first place were people, but they don't argue for saving people. That's a very ironic contradiction in the first place. But let's directly move on into the rebuttals. Side opposition's main point and single point within today's debate was why you're not fixing the death of people because we don't fix the core of the problem, which is politics. We have about 6 points of analysis regarding this. First of all, we told you why the trickle-down effect at least works in certain countries. So we still save at least one more life than side negative does. And that is our value that we argue for as justice within today's debate. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, the only reason why they can actually assume that our model is worse than theirs is because under their model, political change is going to happen. But we think that that's not going to happen. There are two case scenarios. First of all, when they agree to the conditions. If they agree to the conditions, which is first of all very unlikely, it requires too much time. Even if these countries have a stance that they say that they're willing to accept the conditions to a certain extent, you have to negotiate. So even if their stance was affirmed, you still have to kill millions of unnecessary deaths. But second of all, in the cases where they don't agree to the conditions, which is the case that they never responded to and evaded a response to in the Crossfire, we think that they're basically implying that we're arguing for things like citizens' rebellions. We think that this is going to cause even more deaths. In the cases of natural disasters, that's the worst thing that we want. But third of all, Mr. Speaker, when we say that the dictators can use the aid, we agree to that fact. Partial usage and exploitation can occur. But if they don't, if we still don't provide aid, they completely neglected our point about Russia and China, why China is definitely anti-democratic, which is why we think that they're still able to receive the aid from other countries that are unwilling to comply with international customary law, which is why we think that their problem is exactly perpetuated. All they do is kill the people, they don't bring about a political change. But let's move on to the fourth point of rebuttal. At least we actually establish some sort of engagement by providing NGOs, by providing infrastructure, by providing trust within these communities. We think that engagement can definitely change their stances. They told us why, they apparently didn't understand the difference between negotiation and confrontation. What we tell you is that attaching political conditions basically means that you're actually telling these dictators that in the moments of your greatest need, I need to exploit your suffering. That's obviously not going to bring about an effective change. What we're at least doing is that we acknowledge that immediate change cannot happen, unlike what side negative does. But we do say that there can be trust, there can be gradual reformation processes. But what's going to happen under their model is that there's going to be hypocrisy. The United States is exploiting human rights, using that as an excuse to achieve a different means. Why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we exploit human beings within our own country so that we can achieve some other means? We think that that kind of hypocritical stance, first of all, justifies dictatorship countries from continuing their current actions, but second of all, most importantly, we think that other countries are willing to disobey that principle as well. We think that that's ultimately harmful. But what we tell you is that even if we don't go through negotiation, which they don't believe in for some odd reason, we think that elites within the country are still going to recognize that the help all comes from abroad. In the status quo, in extreme cases like North Korea, even the elites don't really know that the dictator doesn't have enough capacity to save them. What's going to happen under our model is that they're going to see that foreign aid is what's actually sustaining the dictators. There's more incentive for them to defect, for instance. There's more incentive for them to rebel against the government. That only happens under our scenario. So at the end, what do? You're going to wait until they agree, which we think is going to take millions of years before these rogue states actually agree in the first place. According to their characterization, they talked about why we're going to provide these, easy kinds of conditions where you can easily agree to. In that case, that undermines the effectiveness. You have a wishy-washy stance here. You have to decide between the two. Are the conditions going to be harsh, or secondly, are the conditions going to be so soft that you're not even going to make that political change that you want so much in the first place? Once you clarify your stance, we're willing to debate this motion. Thank you.
You may.
Ladies and gentlemen, we find a failing case from the affirmative side when they come and say that they value human life. But they are really relying on the trickle-down effect, a very hazy term, a very assumptive term, saying that somehow the government will, the aid there will trickle, so even if the government takes away the aid, somehow it will trickle down to citizens. At least some will be saved. But even if some are not solved, then we don't care. They're having a very irresponsible measure here, and their alternative is very vague and very hardly achievable. What we want is a very practical and a pragmatic measure to save people's lives. That is why our criteria is utilitarianism. We want to save more and the most life, which is why can be only achieved when there is a political condition that ensures that the proper aid will be delivered to the people. So let's look at the first clash, which is who will save more lives, because that was the most core in today's debate between both sides. The affirmative side was busy pushing the burden on us, saying that we won't save any lives in the end if the government does not accept the political conditions. But the political conditions, ladies and gentlemen, that we gave were something that was not very difficult to comply upon. It was simply saying that feed your own citizens. If there is an aid delivered, deliver it back to your own citizens, which is they're very easy terms to be accepted from the recipient government itself. But we say that is the first premise under our case, saying that these conditions in the first place are things that are not very difficult to be complied upon. But even if there isn't compliance upon the government, we say that is still just because if the aid, we'd rather give no aid rather than the aid be fulfilling the bellies of the government and the corrupt government, being used for nuclear development purposes, being used against their own citizens. In the example of Mogadishu in 1992, they used the government, the warlords stole the money and the food aid that were all given by their citizens and used it to feed their own military and buy weapons. And the weapons were used against their own populations. We say that this kind of situation is very unjust and very problematic, which is why we want to ensure that the government, we rather give no aid than whether the government actually abusing the money and the aid that is delivered to these kind of countries. Which is why our case is more pragmatic in that sense. Their case is not doing anything. They're simply throwing in money without actually looking at the consequences, ladies and gentlemen, and when the money gets to the government and how the money will really be used in the country. The trickle effects that they expect may not happen, and in that case, whose lives are they really saving? Moreover, let's talk about the situations that we have provided you with. The corrupt government, number one, was the corrupt government. If the government is corrupt, as I've previously and continuously emphasized, that the government, the proper aid will never be delivered. In the cases of North Korea and Cuba, they will simply use it for their own self-interest and self-serving. However, moreover, even if that is not such serious and radical cases, the government may be simply weak in distribution itself. Therefore, the marginalization will be even more worsened in these situations. Because let's look at the situation of the country itself. Because when there is a natural disaster, or when there is all of the social structures are really collapsed and nothing is properly functioning, there is a confusion, and when people are in life in their situations, they get desperate, which is why there is an innate conflict and confusion inside the country itself. Which is why in this disaster situation, there has to be a really proper system that functions in terms of it. When there shouldn't be an oversupply, there shouldn't be an undersupply. When there is an undersupply, people are to die. But if there is an oversupply, people are going to use that oversupply to use it for black markets, or use it to sell it for their own self-interest, to feed their own families and for their interests. So they're going to simply take advantage out of it. So it is not only the government that we have to be careful about, but inside the society itself, there is an innate social, in the circumstances only make it that it has to be this kind of confusion that leads to the inefficient distribution of resources. People will abuse the aid that is provided to them if they are properly provided, and even if there is an undersupply, people will be desperate that they will be stealing, robbing, or even committing crimes in order to achieve access to these kind of aids. That is what we find very problematic with local development aid. And there is when there is a weak government in the first place, which is why the international society, it is their role to actually intervene in these situations and provide a mechanism that can actually solve these situations, therefore save more lives. So who saves more lives at the end of the debate, ladies and gentlemen? We say that only under our case can people properly be saved when there are people actually dying. Simply rather than relying on somehow when the hazy future, when there is a negotiation happening to make political reforms, we say that political reforms can happen in the future when the situation itself is solved. And we say that is our major stance in the first place, which is like when they try to come up with arguments like negotiation, we cannot accept this simply because it is a very far off stance. Just because there is a negotiation going on, it doesn't mean that the government, when these kind of irresponsible and corrupt government, the atrocities will suddenly be so compliant to and be generous in properly functioning to deliver the aid to the citizens. In these situations, we find our case more just in saving at least the lives possible through the possible aids and with the force of the international society. There is, which is why we strongly negate. Thank you.
There are mainly two issues in today's debate. Firstly, regarding the short-term life-saving issue, and secondly, regarding long-term political changes. Let's directly move on into the first issue. Who really tackles the short-term changes in a more efficient manner? We told you why we at least save more lives. They kill off more lives. They simply didn't acknowledge the fact about the trickle-down effect that we kept on mentioning throughout the debate. Well, first of all, we tell you that if that's the case, to make NGOs directly go in. It worked in Biafra, it worked in Nigeria, it worked in Lebanon. We think that in a lot of these cases, direct intervention actually worked. That's a solution that we proposed. But second of all, let's look into the characteristics of most of this humanitarian aid. Most of this humanitarian aid comes in forms of infrastructure, food, or water. In the case of infrastructure, what's the government going to do? Come in and destroy it? We don't think there's any point of doing that. But second of all, in the cases of food or water, let's say, we think that, oh sorry, I forgot my mic. In the cases of food or water, we think there is actually going to be a necessity, immediate necessity. Therefore, people are going to use it up immediately. The government cannot really trade it in like water in the black market. We don't think that this is really necessary for the government's military in the first place. They need oil, not food and water. But third of all, even if you think that it's used that way, we at least save 7 more lives. They kill millions of more lives. That's why we think that in the concept of justice, because we think that justice means saving more lives, they're actually killing off more lives when the long-term political change is never guaranteed in the first place. But furthermore, we mentioned the point about why their point is not completely valid unless China and Russia exist, because they are going to fuel these aids. They are going to fuel these dictatorship countries. The exact problem is going to repeat itself. We mentioned it exactly 3 times in today's debate, and I counted, trust me, they never engaged in it, not once. But let's move on to the long-term development about politics, right? We found a fundamental contradiction within their case. We asked them, what if they deny, starting from the first crossfire? They told us, well, they're not going to deny because we're going to have these easygoing policies. Well, then none of the problems are going to be solved. If you're not proposing a radical change within politics, then you're never going to tackle any of the core issues that you mentioned. We mentioned that throughout the entire debate. Again, no engagement. But we furthermore talked about why hypocrisy furthermore justifies the actions of the dictators. We told you that dictators are going to think, if the United States can do that, why can't we? This is actually going to justify their actions. Again, no engagement. We told you why we build trust, why negotiation is working in the status quo. They're trying to deny that fact and simply cut off all avenues of negotiation. We think that this is extremely harmful. If you actually, let's say that in the condition where they accepted the political conditions, even if they did, because there is a lack of trust and faith among countries, there's always the possibility that they're going to turn their backs later on. They're going to revert back to a dictatorship. That's why we think that trust should be the foundation. They never provide that essential foundation in the first place. So because they, first of all, never engaged to our 3 most important points, but second of all, because we think that they don't promote for justice, either in the short term or either in the long term, we think that we take today's debate home. We're more than proud to propose.
I think